Rik Willard is the founder and managing director of the Agentic Group, an industry-leading blockchain and frontier tech consulting group and global federation of advanced tech companies. Prior to Agentic, Rik co-founded Mint Combine, the world's first digital currency think tank, where he led research efforts on media, blockchain, and tokenization. He's also appeared as a digital and blockchain expert on CNN and CNBC. Join Rik now as he explores blockchain, value, and philosophy in this important talk.
Hi, and thanks for choosing to spend your valuable time here with me this morning, New York time anyway. I really need a few hours to unpack the actual subject that we're talking about, and if I did that, you probably would never speak with me again. So I'll try to be respectful of the 45 minutes that we have today, and hopefully you'll come away from this session with some usable thoughts. I'm going to make some assertions which you may or may not agree with, and these assertions are forged in the trench wars of the early internet, when idealism was high and we thought of ourselves as warriors of a new age. The mission at that time was to upend the existing power elite and make the world a better place, much like we're discussing today. Unlike many speakers here, I do not have a PhD or a master's degree. I have the equivalent of a battlefield promotion, which basically means that I'm a hardened veteran who happens to be among the few survivors thus far. So you might call it a master's of empirical sciences. It was a battle in the early internet. If you can imagine trying to convince someone who had never used a personal computer that they needed a website, you get an idea of what it was like. These people had never seen a mobile phone, and we had zero financial lifts from VCs or private banks, and we lacked the momentum of capital that we enjoy today. So these early days of the internet were a mashup of westward ideological expansion, the age of robber barons, and the Gutenberg press all rolled into one. This engendered seismic shifts in society, in finance, and in access that have occurred over the last quarter century. Now, over the last 2.5 days, a lot of us have been talking about the nature of digital data, how we use it, how we abuse it, various directions and issues surrounding it, and a number of problems have been pointed out specifically, such as privacy, social good, and fake news. I see these all as serious issues that we have to reckon with if we are able to make any headway at all in creating an internet that works for a general good rather than serving solely the interests of capital and governments. So I need to do that by starting at the beginning. And this is clearly a very edited version of events, but I hopefully think it would be enough to take you somewhere that I believe we need to go for this particular talk. So in the early 1980s, I had a very brief stint in journalism as a junior writer for the Washington Post and the Baltimore Afro-American. And I learned very quickly two things. One, journalists don't make a lot of money. And two, more importantly, that the editorial policy of the Post was whatever Katharine Graham woke up saying it was that particular day. The First Amendment has very little to do with the business of journalism. But as a student, I was fully indoctrinated in the ethos of journalistic integrity. And upon learning it was just a business and a low-paying one at that, I made up my mind that if I was going to write nonsense, then I'd better get paid a lot more money for it. So I switched gears and wound up back in New York. And at that time, advertising was in its heyday. This is pre-internet. It was at that time the fullest expression of consumerism that the earth had yet seen. Advertising was the engine that made all consumerism possible. And the art and science of mass persuasion emerged as a dominant driver of American culture. It unleashed a virus so strong that it had a major role in helping to destroy the USSR. In fact, it can be argued that weaponized consumerism won the Cold War, and it became a major tool in the arsenal of the West. So having been a major sci-fi nerd my entire life, Huxley, Orwell, Philip K. Dick, et cetera, I had got a technology bug in the late 80s and fused my considerable advertising skills at the time with large outdoor HD TV screens. I wound up working with companies like Sony, Toshiba, and Panasonic to move HDTV technology into mass awareness. As a sidebar to science fiction, I was influenced by the movie Blade Runner at the time, which was the first visual representation of a large LED advertising screen. And for those of you who remember the movie, it featured a Japanese model dressed up in sort of geisha garb selling Coca-Cola. That made a stark impression on my 20-something-year-old brain and actually influenced a lot of what happened with me later on. Also, HDTV, by the way, few of you have actually seen HDTV. What you're viewing now is digital TV or DTV. HDTV is actually an analog technology that was sold to the Japanese by the US company RCA in the 1940s. It's a vacuum tube cathode ray technology, and it does not exist anymore. It's a dead tech. But in that case, that was my first encounter with the power of electronic media and my first realization that this was where things were heading. In my heart, I still carried some hope that electronic media could and would do things that conventional media, as it was then known, could not or would not do. For these HDTV screens, I secured a number of high-profile, high-visibility locations that included Grand Central Terminal, Penn Station, and the old World Trade Center. And that was considered very big stuff in the late 80s, early 90s. And it was in the hands of myself and my little group of very young people. And it was a lot of fun. As the only independent commercial HDTV business of its kind in the Western Hemisphere, we were positioned as a showcase for HD technology. And it made it pretty easy to convince MIT Media Lab, Columbia Pictures, MetLife, and a lot of other influential entities to either partner with us in kind or to pay us to advertise their companies on the screen. We had some very lofty ideas, like paying New York subway musicians for the rights to film them and to show them on screen instead of having to work in the crowded bowels of the subway system. We talked with poets about displaying their writing and worked with nonprofit artist collectives to film and show their content pro bono. We felt that we were clearly more ethical than broadcast television and more relevant than some sort of crass advertising play. So maybe we were and maybe we weren't, but it didn't take long for a local group, this so-called Friends of Grand Central, to effectively put two bullets into the head of the company in classic New York execution style, with two well-placed articles in the New York Times that really decried the visual pollution that advertising was creating in New York. So many of you who've been to New York City should be laughing right out now because that's all you could really see. In those days, you had to basically build a broadcast TV station to run an outdoor screen, which is something I can now do on my phone, and we'll get to that in a second. It just so happens that my tech leads were early web heads. Again, this is now the early 1990s, and they had introduced me to Telnet and Gopher and bulletin boards over the previous year or so. And I thought that was cute, but I had bigger fish to fry until, of course, I didn't. So after a few months of licking my wounds and being pilloried by the New York media cabal, I had to start over again. I had to pivot. And I would subsequently pivot again several times in my digital life. But everyone and everything has an origin story. And this was a brief backstory about how I actually came to work in the internet. So after being exiled by the New York media elite, I bought a 256 Pentium, 256, an IBM clone, took it home, and like a bad Keith Moon imitation, I laid all of the components out on the floor and reconstructed the machine from the bottom up with no guide. I had had some training on computers. I had learned through my high school and early college how to code punch cards, and that's how old I am. Then moved to BASIC and Fortran and COBOL and eventually C, but never really got past that rudimentary language. So I had some understanding of how to code, but I really became intimate with the machine at that time. And with nothing better to do, I got myself online. Joined a BBS, then 2, then 10. That's a bulletin board service for those of you who don't know. And within 3 months, I knew pretty much as anyone about the internet, decided to start another company in this brand new digital frontier. But I still had this nagging ethical streak and believed that the internet could be used for amazing good works. But the only way to finance the work I wanted to do was to build a corporate website, then another, then another, then an e-commerce site, then a global digital marketing program, and on until my passion to change the world had devolved into a passion to close another deal. Then to create more deals, chase more deals, close and chase, rinse and repeat. At that time, the internet was a dangerous place to try to make a living. Every existing media wanted to kill you, and they used their full power to try to do so. Just recently, really, in history, have newspapers and TV stations and networks come on board full-throated, in a full-throated way onto the internet. They used to be the adversaries. But money is what kept digital moving in the form of Wall Street quants and knowledge management for corporations. The only digital tech you could effectively sell in the mid-1990s were essentially knowledge management tools for corporate efficiency and writers, what we call trading bots. All in all, we didn't do too badly during that period. We didn't do too badly, and business was great. And as digital media blossomed, we won awards, we worked with the largest companies, we became rock stars in our own right, and we developed these bespoke applications that generally did okay. And by 1999, I had clearly established a name in the business. Then there was the crash. Luckily, I had exited just before the crash, more luck than skill. And between 2000 and 2010, my expertise in digital screens from the previous iteration before my .com had taken me around the world and planted the seeds of my mobile work, my resulting mobile work, because really to me, mobile is another screen. It's just a personal one and one that's always on, one that you can't afford to get rid of and that holds your life in its hands and not vice versa. And this is key to understanding how the use of data was viewed and conceived in the early days of mobile. So around the same time, I started studying the work of Paco Underhill. He's then the undisputed king of retail behavioral science. And I applied his work in using personal screens, phones and pads, to create consumer experiences from geolocated wayfinding, which we now call maps, to predictive algorithms that learned preferences and delivered them in real time, which should now begin to sound very familiar to you. At that time, it was still rocket science and expensive to do. Also during this period, I helped develop the multi-screen Times Square that we're all pretty familiar with, and worked with a major global resort and casino to R&D the concept of players' points as an extant economy, developing theories of how one could derive additional value outside of the gaming experience as a community-driven economy. Of course, all roads leading back to the hotel consumer experience, and no matter where you happen to be in the world. With an increasingly hyper-connected global population, all things then became possible. Now we're talking now around 2007. And when I say all things, I really mean no holds barred. We truly believe that we could run the world, or at least a good part of it. And the final slide on every PowerPoint presentation ever done in the early 2000s had some version of the prevailing mantra, which is, quote unquote, our goal is world domination. This would have been on any early Facebook deck. It would have been on any early .com deck. One form or another was in fact world domination. This was said and this was practiced. So when it comes down to it, our real friend, money. It wasn't egalitarianism. It wasn't it had morphed rather from a need to do something amazing and humanly intensively important. It boiled down to who could pay for these things to happen, and it boiled down after that into who could pay. So because of corporate involvement and because of Wall Street involvement, banks and corporations essentially saved the internet because it couldn't be funded any other way. Charles Schwab and Ameritrade saved the internet. by perpetuating the illusion of democratized financial and educational freedom. But as we learned over time, that freedom exists within a walled camp, and ultimately it benefits the funders over anybody else. Like I said, media, advertising, and all content producers, unlike today's landscape, were initially antagonists against the rise of the internet itself. So my first assertion is that ideology is the mother of the internet and money is its father. This is the yin-yang of it. And it's crucial to understand because capital and advertising birth consumerism. Now, through these observations in the next few minutes, I want to convey to you what we're up against and what we're fighting for. We've heard about dangers in the present trajectory of digital data, the threats of the end of privacy, assuming privacy ever actually existed, the rise of totalitarianism, and so on. These are real concerns that lead me to my second assertion, that since money has always been a key driver of the internet, it is important not to lose sight of some facts about the nature of money itself. The first is capital generates momentum. It develops large-scale projects, creates jobs, and seems to be a public good on the face of it, therefore locking people in to a capital-intensive system. That momentum generates power. That power creates a prevailing agenda. And any prevailing agenda is expressed through a code of ethics. So at its heart, the internet as it stands today reflects a capitalist, hence consumerist agenda. This is a natural outgrowth of how the entire internet itself started. And this may seem obvious, but its roots are much deeper than any side discussions can actually challenge. And this is where I'm heading with all of this. So I returned to New York from this casino experience in Las Vegas and in Asia after the crash with my well-earned Master of Empirical Sciences degree in behavioral technology. And I was immediately introduced to Bitcoin through a friend, an old friend from Web 1.0, as it was even then called. So I had known about early forays into digital money like eCash and a few others. And these were all dismal failures for a number of reasons. And because they were failures, the internet early on defaulted to the use of credit cards and banks that distributed them, making the banks very happy, but creating a porous environment, a porous data environment that was ripe for criminal undertakings. Things were so unsecure. We think they're unsecure now, and I should note everything on the internet is unsecure in that regard, but even more so then. So it's pretty interesting, to note that while here I was building early e-commerce sites, I was never foolish enough to use one until maybe 2010 or so, when it became very convenient to do so, and I would use a certain card to go online with, knowing that if that one got hijacked, then that was fine. So Bitcoin came along to solve maybe the most elusive problem with digital money, and that was how to prevent double spending. That means that if I give you $1 in real life, you have that dollar and I don't. But since the internet is a massive Xerox machine, the problem heretofore, before Bitcoin, had been, okay, I'm going to replicate that transaction 1 million times. And that just wouldn't do it, wouldn't work. So the cryptological aspect of the Bitcoin code fixed that issue. Bitcoin was really the first breath of economic fresh air in over 100 years. But, we shouldn't forget that it's also a technology which suggests some fundamental changes in societal structure. This is where I've spent the last decade or so of my life observing these shifts and responding to them in various ways. So anyway, 3 months after being introduced to Bitcoin, I founded the world's first digital currency think tank called the Mint Combine. And we work primarily with governments and corporations to work out the feasibility of things like Sharia-compliant digital currencies, central bank digital currencies, and even corporate digital currencies. And we'll see, iterations of all those pop up as we keep testing the boundaries of this space. And this alone was mind-boggling, and it kept us up at night. So it still really does keep me up at night. But upon the realization of blockchain as a standalone platform for the creation of asset-backed tokens, I knew that a phase shift was in progress. And this is where the message of this talk actually begins, even if it turns out to be a bit more brief than the exhaustive lead-up. But it's important to understand the roots of the movement, the relationship between innovation, capital, and human endeavor that brings us to this point. Bitcoin and blockchain finally showed me a way, a pathway, to envision digital value outside of the established money channels, outside of corporate economies, outside of governments. So this finally was something truly new. Because I don't believe, in fact, that the internet itself can be said to be new. To me, it's the newest iteration of communications with profound sociopolitical and economic implications, to be sure. But it's a natural extension of the machine age and the quest for efficiency, essentially. It's like Gutenberg and Gemeinschaft on shrooms. So my third assertion is that the value revolution as viewed through digital assets represents the most profound shift in humanity since the invention of money itself. Through a reckoning, the notion of a global code of usage. This can profoundly change our understanding of money, economics, society, and perhaps even humanity. I remember reading a book by the German philosopher, proto-social scientist, and sort of bloviating neo-Kantian Georg Simmel. In 1900, he wrote a much too long book named The Philosophy of Money. And while I strongly suggest that everyone read it, I'll save you the 600 pages for now and try to synopsize the basic tenet of the book as I understand it, which is society doesn't rule money. Money in its present iteration rules and changes society and recreates and reforms it in many ways that benefit money itself. Money fragments humans in increasingly complex ways that concretize and normalize its underlying ethical structure, which is to make more money. There's more to this, but for our purposes, today, this particular synopsis will have to suffice. So for all you QAnons out there, the world isn't run by a few families. However, it's just trying to be run by a few families because the world of capital is so fragmented that it's hard to ever get its stuff together under one banner to present any sort of calcified rules. What we have is perpetual war among varying nations and capitalist bosses. And this war itself is grinding to a chaotic halt right in front of our eyes. The model of economy as we know it is coming to an end of its own volition. Blockchain thinking, which means permission environments, authentication, identity, attribution, and direct payments, brings about certain questions about how far this new internet of value can reach, how it can affect economic and ideological hegemony, financial inclusion, or financial reimagination, privacy and freedom, money and economic value, and ultimately societal values and ethics. All of these high-level concepts blend into each other at varying points, but the underlying truth is that the internet of communication was disruptive, that's for sure. The internet of money continued the extractive ways of capital, which is why we call it data mining. But the internet of value proposes a new way. This is a paradigm of value extrusion or amplification, identifying value within people and communities especially, and attaching real value to their contributions to the world as a whole. So these assets, whatever assets they happen to be, intellectual or physical, can be tethered to production of any kind and expressed without the need of the gatekeepers of capital, at least the traditional ones. And that's what you really need to know here. You can be your own banker. Your community is your economic partner. And a world of like-minded individuals can be your investor community. So let's say that all that's real and doable tomorrow. We still have the question of ethical differences between communities of value to consider. Or do we? What we do know is that all money has two sets of values attached to it. First, beyond the face value of the money, denominationally, $5, $10, $20, which can be somewhat fluid due to inflation in markets. There's an ideology, and this ideology, this philosophy, is more fixed than fluid. So when you make, spend, or give or lend a US dollar, you're virally transmitting a philosophy. In terms of the USA, that philosophy is that the United States is an arbiter of Western hegemony, also translated as American exceptionalism, and earlier, perhaps, manifest destiny. So it's the idea that the US is the strongest economy on the planet. The internet, based as it is on the USD and the euro primarily, is still haunted by Eurocentric ideology and ethical codex. But when everyone is connected to their own value source, whose ethics are going to prevail? Which community gets to claim the ethical high ground, and which people arbitrate ethical behavior? We may all agree on certain ethical standards based on our world experience, such as don't steal, don't kill, don't covet your neighbor's stuff. But do those ethics create value propositions that hold up in, say, Asia and Africa or Latin America, beyond the basics? And this is where our conversation about ethical data really needs to go, because without consensus on what ethics should be, the question of ethical data and how it's used and how it's parsed and how it's understood remains sealed off from the actual world. So the ethics, discussion of ethics, the dialectical realities of ethics are not new. They are a human condition. They're not a machine condition. What's really new is digital value creation. And this is the land never before traversed. And the combination of this technological and this very human need for some sort of ethical existence is a real challenge for us to see how our humanity, the stuff of what we're made of as humans. Because in truth, I believe that this may be the last stand of the industrial age before the purge. The seeds we plant now will determine what comes after, whether that is for good or for evil. So I'd like to say one thing in particular about digital fiat. Having worked with central banks, I believe digital fiat is a neutron bomb. It solves nothing, but almost ensures a totalitarian view of money, and the values and the value and the ethics supported thereby. So if you want to see a proto-example of that in action, look to China's digital yuan and how that holds its population hostage to certain ethical standards. I don't say moral standards here on purpose. Ethics and morals are two very different things. The ethical standards of supplication to the Chinese state are obvious, and they are well documented. And what you see happening there, 1984, Orwell can't even hold a candle to. That's real totalitarian hegemony. So we need to be very careful about all this, because what we do and what we create and what we envision in this particular discourse about ethics will be the course of humanity for the next 1,000 years or so. And we can't wait until the time seems right. We have to forge ahead, and we have to challenge ourselves daily. We have to reinvent ourselves. And this really means getting very deeply into our own humanity. This means not looking at this strictly as a machine problem or a data problem. This is a human problem. I would argue that we have not known what ethics means as human beings, much less on the internet, and what our output or our data or our social data has really meant on a global scale ever before in human times. We have been very good at imposing ethics, Egyptian, Roman, Macedonian, British, European in general, American. We've been very good at that. But what we haven't done is, very well at all, is to establish a set of global ethics that everybody can live with and every culture can live with. So that's the magnitude of the challenge that we're talking about. And this is at the heart of the value revolution, at least the digital value revolution. We cannot think in terms of an ethical standard for the internet in terms of data until we mine what it means in our own human existence. So we have to be prepared to strip away a lot, if not all, of the notions that we have around our values, the nature of value itself, the nature of economics, and everything else that we do, certainly the nature of consumerism, because that's the driving force for all of it. That keeps the engine greased. I apologize for working in advertising. I didn't know at the time that that I was doing something that couldn't be easily reversed. In fact, I would have said that you were crazy for even wanting to reverse it. But again, the idea of Bitcoin and blockchain allowed us the room to think more expansively about what these things mean. It broke the emotional and intellectual hold that we who work in this industry had on money and on capital. It literally allowed us to think outside the box and allowed us to also look at gatekeepers very differently. Most of what we see in the ICO boom, the madness that created, and the present NFT craze is simply a community of technologists and finance people funding themselves. And let's be straight about that. They're trying to create a marketplace. Now, in and of itself, ethically, this is horrendous, right? It's the same old people doing the same old things, and you can call it market manipulation, and you wouldn't be wrong. However, it proves to be an interesting proof of concept, because if they as a community can do it, then actually other communities can do it. Not just them, we can do it. And I say we, in the broadest sense. I actually come from both technology and finance backgrounds. So, I chose to leave those camps to create something very different and to envision this very differently. So, from what I speak, I know that this recent NFT, $60 million auction, $68 million auctioned artwork was more than likely, provably, an inside job, so to speak. But that's okay, because it can be that for everyone. It is about creating your own value and molding that within your own ethical framework. That happens to be the ethics of cash, and the ethics of market manipulation. And then there is an ethical basis for that kind of thinking. We wouldn't call it that necessarily, those of us who are here, we wouldn't call it ethical, but ethics, again, are not morals. So we have to be also very, very cognizant of the fact that there are different ethical frameworks out there. But these are proofs nonetheless. And we who envision a better world can harness these proofs and point them towards a higher truth. But again, it has to start in our own hearts and in our own heads. We have to question the values of racism, of genderism. We have to question the ethics and morals that we have around how we make our livings and how we treat our fellow human beings. So we can't speak of ethical data until we have a better handle on the ethics we ourselves subscribe to. We build our tools, and then our tools build us. And there's a window of success here. As 16th century samurai Yamamoto Tsunetomo wrote in his book of Hidden Leaves, now is at that time, and at that time is now. So with that said, thanks for your patience. Thanks for letting me ramble on a bit. I'm going to answer some questions that I see on the right-hand side now. But in general, if you want to get into the weeds on a lot of this, and I've covered some ground that certainly invites some rebuttal or certainly challenges. I hope it does. You can reach me through the Agentic Group website at, of course, agenticgroup.com. So now I'm going to look over here and I'm going to answer some of this stuff here. All right. So ooh, that's nice. Okay, so here's the question. Often blockchain pioneers talk about currency governments cannot regulate or interfere with as being highly beneficial, with an arguably libertarian neoliberal streak running through these arguments. Do you think blockchain has an inherently libertarian neoliberal tinge to it? And do you think deregulated currency necessarily means democratically owned and accountable? Wow. Okay. This is a great question. So, number one, nobody knows who made Bitcoin. Satoshi Nakamoto could be man, woman, bot, group, could be anybody. It's hard to trust things you don't know, where their origins are. But I would say that the origin is mathematical in nature, and people tend to trust that. That language tends to lie less. Statistics lies more, and that's a part of math. But code lies less. So I would say that there is a strong libertarian streak in digital currencies, remarkably strong. As a matter of fact, almost overwhelming. But there's also a major corporatist and capitalist view that's emerged in digital currencies. And you can see people like the Winklevoss twins setting up funds, the Gemini Fund on Wall Street. You can see in America, especially, Bitcoin being traded as an asset. In other places of the world, a commodity. In Japan, it's an actual currency. It's a full-on currency. So yes, it is libertarian. Yes, it has a neoliberal streak within it also. Also, a very non-liberal streak. And one good example of that is the Orania group in South Africa. The Orania community, remember I speak about community currencies here, is a white separatist group. They have made their Orania token and pegged it as on a one-to-one basis with the South African rand. Now, what's interesting about that, and it was really what I was getting into, is that people all over the world now who believe in white separatism can fund this experiment. Now, I don't think it's a fundable project myself, but I guarantee you there are certain people in the world who do. So any community can do this, and this is the whole point of value extrusion. They're not extracting anything to create that value. They're extruding a message. They're extruding a meme, and they're amplifying it. That can be done for beneficial purposes as well. So yes, it's not inherently libertarian or neoliberal, but I do think that, by the way, neither is it democratically owned and accountable. People say Bitcoin is not really owned by anyone. Actually, if you have 51% of any given amount of Bitcoin in the world, you de facto own Bitcoin. The example would be Chinese Bitcoin miners, who at one point, if not currently, certainly mined most of the Bitcoin on Earth. And we'll forget about the ecological ramifications or the geopolitical ramifications of that. The fact is that they could have killed this, or they could have forked it, and it has been forked several times, anytime that they chose. So all of those are really a yes, except for does it necessarily mean it's democratically owned and accountable? That answer is no. So I'll move on to the next. You've described the challenges of being able to fund positive work online. Do you see this as a problem within capitalism or something more unique to the internet? If so, how would you like things, I guess, to improve in this regard? Is it a problem within capitalism? I think it's a natural evolution of capital itself. Not leaving the age of exchange, we're simply evolving the age of exchange. And I think there's a big difference there. What used to be cowrie shells or accounts on stone tablets, what used to be barter systems turned into coinage, turned into paper money, turned into what we call now economics and capital. This has all been a constant evolution throughout humanity, and differs only in execution and in its ethical foundations. So this is just another part of that. And it's never been done on a global basis before, which is what we're talking about. If you have even a feature phone or a dumb phone, that is, you can participate in this. And that is a big difference. And that creates some much bigger questions that I've tried to touch on during this small talk. Another question, who are the emerging financial activism members? I really don't want to talk about that because I disagree with so many of them. But I would give you some examples of what emerging financial activism looks like. There's a group called Moeda in Brazil that actually tokenizes a seed fund for women farmers so they can get their hands on readily available seed to be able to farm more effectively, and then they have an output which is then dictates the value of the token itself. So you solve a lot of issues there. Number one is access to capital. Number two is access to the means of production, the seed, and the land itself as well. So this is a great example of the disintermediation that tokens can have in both in banking, in ownership, in land ownership, and production, which is neither capitalist nor socialist. It actually defies political categorization. I don't know the name of that category yet, so we call it tokenization. But sooner or later, there's going to be, have to be some way to name this, and I think we're all a part of that ethical conversation, what that means, and how it's implemented. So I have a couple more minutes left. I'm going to jump into stuff. There's so many questions. Is there trouble in establishing a global ethical agenda everyone can subscribe to, or is it that people occupying positions in unjust social systems, dictatorships, highly human rights abusive regimes, etc., that they refuse to buy into? There's always trouble in establishing a global ethical agenda. I did touch on that. It's almost impossible, not impossible, but I would say nearly impossible. I think that's where smart contracts come into play. Smart contracts on the blockchain can enforce certain if-then postulations, right? If this happens, then that happens. If you do something and it's deemed ethical within the constraints of the code, then you get this amount of reward or access or whatever. Will every dictatorship or human rights abuser allow access to that system? That's different. And on the closing note, because I only have 2 minutes left, I need to say this. Thank you for those questions, by the way. They're amazing. I have a lot more I wish I could get to. But I want to end with one thing. We think of banks, this is part of the phase that we're going through right now. We think of banks as the gatekeepers to our economic lives. And that right now is a fact. But here's a new fact. Banks will soon become irrelevant. What digital currencies will do will make exchanges among the world rise to a greater or lesser degree, make the process by which value is exchanged a lot more direct for most of the world, not all of it. But who's really in charge? Who is getting to drive the ethical agenda of all of this? The platform always wins. So who's the platform? That would be mobile companies. That would be telcos. It won't be banks. Telcos will be banks. They won't look like it, but they'll certainly act like it. And we have to worry about that, the constriction or not of where money flows or where value flows around the earth will be largely in the hands if there's one player at all who has control over the entirety of that. It is the telco sector. That's especially important in places like Africa and Latin America, which never had landlines to begin with, or local phone companies largely. Of course, they do in many parts all over, and leapfrog straight into mobile phone usage. So those mobile phone companies hold a lot of power, and we're going to have to deal with that at some point. And we're going to have to figure out what that really means. But banks, really, who will need a bank in a generation? Very, very, very few people. But we will all need access. So it's 11:45, and I've got to go. Take care. And again, hit me at agenticgroup.com. And if you want to talk about any of this moving forward. Thanks so much.